Hello, and welcome back to the Perspectives in History podcast. I'm your host, Willem Conner. Thank you, as always, for listening. This is part 5 of our series on the Marquis de Lafayette, entitled The Final Reckoning. So you may have noticed a change to the show recently. I've decided to start running ads on the podcast. It wasn't a decision that I made lightly. I resisted doing this up until this point because I know how annoying and intrusive those advertisements can be. The fact of the matter is that things are not going too great for me financially, and I feel that the podcast has grown to the point where running ads on it could feasibly make it so that this project at least breaks even. Don't get me wrong, I very much enjoy doing this, and I fully intend to keep doing it until I'm no longer able to, but I would be lying if I said that this podcast wasn't a giant money sink for me. So, I apologize for the annoyance. I've already started to work on optimizing ad placement within the episodes so as to be as unobtrusive as possible. I'm also taking the opportunity to remaster a few old episodes where the audio quality is not quite up to the show's current standards, so this may take some time. One last thing I have to say on the matter is that while I have set up some parameters around what kind of advertisements can be run on the show, I don't have time to personally screen all of them, so if by chance you get an ad that you find objectionable in any way, please bring it to my attention so that I can address the issue. In other news, work on the final episode of the Korean War series is progressing well, and we are on track to have it released by mid-November, as I said before, so please keep an eye out for that. Anyway, that should do it for housekeeping announcements, so let's get on with the show. In the previous episode of our series on the life of the Marquis de Lafayette, we brought the narrative from July 1778 up to about April 1780. After the formalization of the alliance between France and the United States in March 1778, the following months would see the first real test of their ability to cooperate, and our protagonist Lafayette was certain to play a central role in this. His moment came in early July, shortly after the Battle of Monmouth, when a French fleet commanded by Vice Admiral Charles-Henri the Comte d'Estaing was spotted near the mouth of Delaware Bay. Unfortunately, they had arrived too late to accomplish their original mission, which was to entrap the British fleet in the bay as they evacuated Philadelphia. Washington put forward a new proposal, a combined American and French assault on the British fortifications at Newport, Rhode Island. In early August, he dispatched Lafayette to the scene in order to act as a liaison between Vice Admiral d'Estaing and American General John Sullivan. It took quite a bit of convincing, but Lafayette eventually managed to get both leaders to agree to a plan of action. Unfortunately, the plan went awry when the Americans attacked too early. Meanwhile, the French attempted to engage a squadron of British ships in combat, but were caught in a storm that caused significant damage to the French vessels. The Americans and French were quick to blame each other for the debacle. General Sullivan wrote a lengthy diatribe accusing the Comte d'Estaing of cowardice. The patriotic and hot-headed Lafayette lost his temper and argued passionately in defense of his countrymen. He even went so far as to challenge anyone who blamed the French for this defeat to duel him. But before anyone could get hurt, Washington stepped in to resolve the situation. He soothed the egos of the Frenchmen by reassuring them that they were not to blame, chastised his own countrymen for putting their prejudices on display, and above all, he encouraged both sides to put aside their differences and cooperate with each other for the sake of the war effort. After the Battle of Newport, Lafayette spent quite some time in nervous inactivity. He plotted and schemed ways to further help the war effort, perhaps another invasion of Canada or a naval campaign in the Caribbean. In late September, Lafayette received authorization from Washington to return home for the winter. After being reassured by his father-in-law, the Duke d'Enghien, that all had been forgiven and that he would be welcome to return, Lafayette resolved to do exactly that, and arrived in France in early February. Upon his return, Lafayette discovered that much had changed since he first left 2 years ago. While he departed the country as a fugitive from the King's justice, he returned as a widely celebrated hero. News from America of his exploits had earned him celebrity status in France. Everyone, even those who had condemned his initial adventure, now sang his praises. Even King Louis XVI congratulated Lafayette personally for his successes abroad, and allowed him to get away with an extremely lenient punishment for having defied his will 2 years prior. More than anything, though, Lafayette was overjoyed to be reunited with his wife Adrienne after their long separation, and before the end of the year she had given birth to the couple's first son, who was christened George Washington Lafayette. Even during his time on leave, Lafayette remained single-mindedly fixated on assisting the cause of the United States in any way he could. With the collaboration of the famed American diplomat Benjamin Franklin, Lafayette began to dream up all manner of schemes by which he could undermine the British in Europe. Eventually, he and Franklin decided on a rather audacious plan to carry out seaborne raids against various targets along the British coast, but before these plans could be put into action, they were superseded by new orders from Versailles. Lafayette was ordered to prepare for a full-scale invasion of the British Isles. With the recent entry of Spain into the war against Great Britain, the decision-makers in Versailles believed that the combined power of the French and Spanish navies could enable such an attack. For months on end, Lafayette scurried about the country, helping to prepare for an invasion, but, much to his disappointment, these plans never came to fruition. The Franco-Spanish Armada was afflicted by bad weather and an outbreak of smallpox, causing its commanders to lose their confidence in its ability to confront the British Navy, and the plan was eventually called off. With the invasion of England having failed to materialize, Lafayette resolved to redouble his lobbying efforts. He impressed upon the French ministers the importance of sending a new expedition to America at once, an expedition that he himself proposed leading. The French foreign minister and prime minister eventually agreed to send an expedition, but did not appoint Lafayette to lead it. In his place, they chose the Comte de Rochambeau, a 55-year-old veteran of many of France's previous wars. Lafayette was to serve as a liaison between Generals Washington and Rochambeau. As such, he was sent to America ahead of the expedition, and on March 6th, Lafayette, with the blessing of the King and Queen, boarded the ship that was to return him to America. Lafayette's return was much celebrated. At every town he passed through on his way to Washington's headquarters, festivities were thrown in his honor. As he wrote in a letter back to Adrienne, quote, "It is to the roar of the cannon that I arrive or depart. The principal residents mount their horses to accompany me. In short, my love, my reception here is greater than anything that I could ever describe to you." End quote. For the Americans, the return of Lafayette was the first time they'd had cause for celebration in quite some time. The winter of 1779 to 1780 had been yet another low point in a war that had already been marked by several low points. Much has been made of the winter of 1778 to 1779, and the suffering that the army endured at Valley Forge, but this most recent winter proved to be the harshest in recent memory. Blizzards constantly assailed the Continental Army, encamped near Washington's headquarters at Morristown, New Jersey, with many soldiers falling victim to the elements. Making matters worse was the ongoing economic crisis. Skyrocketing rates of inflation had rendered the paper money issued by Congress all but worthless. Washington struggled to provision his men with clothing and food, let alone pay their salaries. Many deserted the ranks, and under such conditions there was not a long line of new recruits to replace them. The size of Washington's army shrank to just 6,000 men, of whom only half were fit for active duty. As Washington summarized the situation in a letter to Congress, quote, "The patience of our soldiers, who have endured every degree of conceivable hardship, is on the point of being exhausted. Drained and weakened as we already are, it will be impossible, if not impractical, to recover. The country is exhausted and the people are dispirited." End quote. On May 10th, Lafayette arrived in Morristown to the great rejoicing of all present. According to Lafayette's close friend, Lieutenant General Alexander Hamilton, Washington's eyes welled up with tears upon being reunited with the Marquis. After the initial pleasantries had been concluded, Washington took Lafayette aside and briefed him on the overall state of the war. As we discussed in the previous episode, in 1779, the British Commander-in-Chief, General Henry Clinton, decided to shift his strategic focus to the southern United States after having encountered a series of setbacks in the north. At the top of his list of priorities were the conquest of the port cities of Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina. Despite the combined efforts of American and French forces, the British captured Savannah in October. A few months later, the British closed in on Charleston and initiated a siege of the city on April 1st. Outnumbered and surrounded on both land and sea, General Benjamin Lincoln and his 6,000 men did their best to defend the city, but on May 12th, Charleston fell. Lincoln and his entire army were taken prisoner. While the Americans suffered defeat after humiliating defeat in the South, the war in the North had largely devolved into a stalemate. Although Clinton and the bulk of his army were busy fighting the Americans in South Carolina and Georgia, New York City, which had been captured by the British in the earliest months of the war, remained a loyalist stronghold. The Americans had long sought to recapture this all-important city, and with Clinton's southern diversion, it seemed that there was finally an opportunity for them to make a move against it. However, as we've seen, the Continental Army was in no state to begin such a massive undertaking. The news that Lafayette had brought with him from France of Rochambeau's new expedition had the potential to break the stalemate in the north. Lafayette urged Washington to attack New York as soon as the French reinforcements arrived. On May 20th, he wrote to France's foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, quote, "If the French troops arrive in time, the chances are good that New York is ours, but if the English have time to regroup, the project may have to be abandoned." End quote. On July 10th, the French fleet laid anchor at Newport, Rhode Island. Washington immediately dispatched Lafayette to confer with Rochambeau, but any hopes for quick and decisive action on the part of the French were quickly dashed. Instead of the promised 6,000 infantrymen, Rochambeau had arrived with less than 5,000, many of whom had taken ill during the voyage and needed time to recover. Worse, the cargo vessels that were supposed to ferry all of the army's supplies across the Atlantic got held up in port and still had yet to arrive. On account of these complications, Rochambeau estimated that it would be at least a month, perhaps 2, before his army was in any condition to fight. Lafayette, never one to admit failure, tried to impress upon the French general the urgency of their situation. Quote, "I assure you, sir, that it is important for us to act during the present campaign, that all the troops which you may expect from France next year, as well as the projects with which you flatter yourselves, will never repair the fatal consequences of inaction. Without American resources, all foreign assistance will accomplish nothing in this country. I think it is important to profit from those moments when you can get cooperation here, for without it you can do nothing for the common cause." End quote. Rochambeau was incensed at the young man's impetuousness. In his reply, he told Lafayette that his opinions were merely the flights of youthful fantasy, while his were based on years of experience. He concluded by informing Lafayette of his intention to meet with Washington and to confer with him directly. After Lafayette penned a sufficiently conciliatory apology, Rochambeau relented, forgiving him his transgression. Quote, "Allow an old father, my dear Marquis, to reply to you as he would a son whom he loves and holds in infinite esteem. You know me well enough to know that at my age, when I have formed a resolution based on military reasons and the interests of the nation, I will never change my mind based on some momentary excitement or emotions. Be ever convinced of my sincere affections, and that if I pointed out to you very gently what displeased me in your last dispatch, I felt at the time convinced that the warmth of your heart and soul had somewhat overheated your enthusiasm and the sagacity of your judgment. Keep the last for the council chamber and reserve all of the first for the hour of action. It is the old father Rochambeau, speaking to his dear son Lafayette, whom he loves and will ever love and esteem until his last breath." End quote. With Rochambeau and Lafayette agreeing to let bygones be bygones, they then returned their attention to the matter at hand. As he said he would, Rochambeau met with Washington and filled him in on the current state of his forces. Washington deferred to Rochambeau's judgment that it would be the wisest course of action to allow some time for his men to coalesce and to wait for their supplies to arrive. In the meantime, there was little else for the Continental Army to do but to engage in a series of skirmishes against the British in and around New Jersey. This task fell to a new elite division composed of soldiers handpicked from regiments from New Hampshire, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania. Washington's choice to lead this new division was Benedict Arnold, who, at this time, was still convalescing from a leg wound that he had suffered 3 years prior. Arnold, who had distinguished himself by leading the capture of Fort Ticonderoga in 1775, felt that his wound prevented him from taking up command in the field, so he passed up on Washington's offer. Instead, Washington appointed Arnold as the commander of West Point, a strategically crucial fortification on the Hudson River in upstate New York. Instead of Arnold, Washington turned to Lafayette to lead this new light division. Lafayette was thrilled at being offered such a prestigious command, and took immense pride in his new unit, outfitting them in snappy new uniforms that he had brought with him from France, and adorning each of them with cockades of red and black feathers to distinguish them from their fellow soldiers. They also carried their own unique pennants, each emblazoned with the words Ultimo Ratio, Latin for the final reckoning, a slogan popularized by legendary French king Louis XIV. Lafayette took great care to ensure that his men were given training befitting of their elite status, and before long the Light Division had acquired a reputation as one of the best in the entire army, renowned especially for their esprit de corps. As Army Surgeon James Thatcher wrote of Lafayette and his division, quote, "A noble spirit of emulation universally prevailed among them. They were the pride of his heart, and he was the object of their regard." End quote. As Lafayette himself later recalled, quote, "The affection between the members of that corps and its leader became legendary in the American army. Like the traveler who brings home presents from distant lands for family and friends, I had returned from France with a costly collection of ornaments for my soldiers, swords for the officers, and banners for the battalions. This troop of chosen men, well drilled and disciplined, were easily recognized by their distinctive red and black plumes." End quote. However, as the summer of 1780 drew to a close, the Light Division had yet to see any major action. The war in the north remained as much of a stalemate as it had ever been, while in the south, the Americans suffered yet another defeat. Earlier in the year, during the siege of Charleston, Washington sent about 4,000 men under General Horatio Gates to relieve the defenders at Charleston. With them was the Baron de Kalb, the Prussian-born nobleman who had befriended Lafayette as they departed Europe. Gates's army was unable to reach Charleston before it fell to the British, but Gates still aimed to halt the British advance somewhere in South Carolina before they could completely envelop the southern colonies. The climactic confrontation of this campaign occurred at Camden, a town in the northern half of the state. Gates insisted on trying to make a stand there against the advice of de Kalb, who believed that the army was in no state to fight. Although they outnumbered their adversaries, the British cavalry under Lord Charles Cornwallis rushed into and broke through the American lines, sending Gates and a large portion of the men running for their lives. However, de Kalb ordered his men to hold the line and make a last stand. Despite de Kalb's valiant efforts, the British prevailed. The Baron himself was among the casualties of the day, having been shot 8 times and stabbed 3. When Cornwallis discovered his mortally wounded opponent lying on the battlefield, he's reported to have said, quote, "I regret to see you so badly wounded, but I am glad to have defeated you." End quote. He had his surgeons tend to de Kalb, but they were unable to save his life. The Baron de Kalb has gone down in history as one of the great heroes of the American Revolution, but he just as easily could have become one of its greatest villains. There's a certain irony in the fact that de Kalb had initially gone to America with the intention of overthrowing Washington and having him replaced with his benefactor, the Comte de Broglie. But upon arriving in the United States, he became a devout patriot, intensely loyal to the cause and to Washington personally. That he had died while following Washington's orders and fighting on his behalf served to cement his legacy as one of the great foreign volunteers who stood behind the American cause, right up there with Kosciuszko, Pulaski, von Steuben, and of course, Lafayette himself. De Kalb's greatest claim to fame, though, is helping usher his friend Lafayette onto the international stage. In the days and weeks leading up to and immediately following their arrival in America, de Kalb was sort of an avuncular figure to the young, impressionable Lafayette. Unbeknownst to either party, when Lafayette bid the Baron farewell as he deported Valley Forge in the winter of 1778, that would be the last time that they saw each other. As Lafayette rode to rejoin the army upon returning to America, de Kalb was already on his way south. In a letter to his wife back home, de Kalb lamented at having missed the opportunity to reunite with his young protege. Quote, "How gladly I would have tarried a few days in Philadelphia to await the arrival of the Marquis de Lafayette. I had hundreds and hundreds of questions to ask him, and would have gladly chatted with him for a few hours." End quote. In mid-September 1780, Washington resolved to travel to Hartford, Connecticut, to confer with Rochambeau once again. On the 17th, Washington set out from his camp. In his entourage were Hamilton, Knox, and Lafayette. While en route, they stopped at West Point to visit Benedict Arnold and see how he was getting on with his new posting. Arnold accompanied Washington and Company across the Hudson River and agreed to host the party for lunch on their way back from Hartford. Washington and Company arrived at Hartford on the 21st and spent much of the next 2 days in talks with Rochambeau and his officers, with Lafayette serving as the principal interpreter during these talks. Washington and Rochambeau found themselves to be in complete agreement as it regarded the necessity of retaking New York City, but they also agreed that such a thing would not be possible until the rest of the French expeditionary force arrived. Rochambeau agreed to put greater pressure on Versailles to expedite the arrival of the remaining ships, but in the immediate term there was nothing else that he could do. Both sides agreed to keep their forces in their current positions while they waited. Once the talks in Hartford were concluded, Washington and his retinue set off to return to the camp in Morristown, New Jersey, of course stopping at West Point to take Arnold up on his offer for lunch. Only when they arrived, neither the general nor his wife were anywhere to be found. Arnold, they were told, was off on some important business. While they waited for him to return, Washington decided to pass the time by inspecting the facilities. Finding the fortifications in a state of disrepair, Washington assumed that Arnold was neglecting his duties. But as it would turn out, this was not the result of idle neglect, but active subversion. Earlier that day, an American patrol captured a British spy, quickly identified as Major John Andre. head of the British intelligence operations in North America. Andre was found to be carrying a series of documents incriminating Benedict Arnold of treason. Among these documents were a copy of notes from a war council that Arnold had participated in, as well as instructions for British commanders informing them of the weakness in West Point's defenses. Before long, the whole truth was revealed. Arnold, using Andre as a middleman, had accepted a bribe of £20,000 from Henry Clinton to effectively surrender West Point to the British without putting up a fight. Upon learning of this betrayal, Hamilton attempted to chase Arnold down and arrest him, but he was able to evade capture and boarded a British frigate bound for New York. From the safety of this ship, the HMS Vulture, Arnold sent a letter to Washington. In this message, Arnold showed no remorse for his actions, but insisted on the innocence of his wife Peggy. For her part, Peggy made a great histrionic display, acting shocked at her husband's betrayal. The reality was that Peggy herself was a staunch loyalist and had, in fact, played an active role in this whole conspiracy. But her theatrics were enough to throw Washington and others off of her scent, allowing her to slip away to New York City to rejoin her husband. Although today, in America, the very name Benedict Arnold is synonymous with traitor, at the time, the American public was in disbelief at his treachery. Lafayette summarized his own thoughts on the matter in a letter that he wrote to the French ambassador. Quote, "I cannot describe to you, sir, to what degree I am astounded by this piece of news. In the course of a revolution such as ours, it's natural that a few traitors should be found, and every conflict which resembles a civil war must necessarily bring to light some great virtues and some great crimes. Our struggles have brought forth some great heroes as well as some great scoundrels. But that a man like Arnold, who had given proof of his talent, of his patriotism, and especially of the most brilliant courage, should at once destroy his very existence and sell out his country to the tyrants against whom he had fought with glory, confounds and distresses me. It humiliates me to a degree that I cannot express. I would give anything in this world if Arnold had not shared our labors with us, and that if this man, whom it still pains me to call a scoundrel, had not shared his blood for the American cause." End quote. Following Arnold's dramatic escape, Washington immediately took action to ensure the security of West Point, appointing Nathaniel Greene to take Arnold's place as commander of the fort. Arnold's plot to surrender West Point to the British had been foiled, but there was still the matter of his accomplice, Major John Andre, who was still in American custody. Washington ordered the formation of a 14-man court-martial, which included Lafayette, to decide the man's fate. The 29-year-old Andre appeared to be the very model of the sophisticated, intelligent, and handsome young army officer that commanded the respect of enemies and allies alike. But the fact of the matter was that he was a spy. He had been caught using a false name and wearing civilian clothing. This dishonorable conduct disqualified him from receiving the usual humane treatment typically afforded to prisoners captured on the battlefield in this period. The court-martial voted unanimously that Andre should be executed by hanging, the legal penalty for treason. Lafayette later confessed to his wife that he came to regret this decision. Quote, "He was an interesting man. The confidant and friend of General Clinton, he conducted himself in such a frank, noble, and honorable way during these days that we imprisoned him, I was foolish enough to develop a real liking for him. In strongly voting to sentence him to the gallows, I could not help but regret what had happened to him." End quote. On October 2nd, 1780, John Andre was executed by hanging. The entire garrison of West Point was in attendance to witness the spy's death. The Arnold affair would prove to be the only bit of excitement in an otherwise uneventful stretch of time. Both Washington and Rochambeau had agreed not to engage in any further offensive actions until the second half of the French expeditionary force arrived. In December, Lafayette made preliminary plans to engage in a raid against British positions on Staten Island, but this action was eventually called off. As the year 1780 dragged on and autumn gave way to winter, Lafayette put in a request for leave and went to Philadelphia. There he met up with his friend and brother-in-law, Noailles. Between Lafayette, Noailles, and Ségur, Noailles had been the last of the group to arrive in America. Together with a group of fellow French officers, Lafayette and Noailles spent the first half of the winter 1780-1781 taking in all the pleasures that the American capital had to offer them. The inhabitants of Philadelphia were taken by the officers' charms, inviting them to participate in banquets, dances, and various other entertainments. It was also during that time that Lafayette received an invitation to join the American Philosophical Society, with the additional honor of being that organization's first foreign member. Meanwhile, the continued delay of the rest of the French expeditionary forces was making Congress quite restless. They were anxious to receive more material support from Europe. In the final months of the previous year, they dispatched Henry Laurens to the Netherlands to negotiate for their support. Laurens, whose tenure as President of Congress ended in December 1778, took up this post and managed to convince the Dutch to support the American cause. But on what was intended to be his return voyage to America, his ship was intercepted and captured by the British Navy. Laurens was taken prisoner and held in the Tower of London. Needless to say, a year later, Congress remained just as anxious as ever. They began to reach the conclusion that the Francophilia of the current ambassador in Paris, Benjamin Franklin, was proving itself a liability, as it prevented him from applying the appropriate amount of pressure on Versailles for more support. With this in mind, Congress decided to dispatch an additional diplomat to France in order to accomplish what Franklin seemed incapable of. Initially, their choice for this mission had been Lafayette, but Lafayette, having only so recently returned to America, did not wish to depart again so soon, and so Congress turned to Henry Laurens' son, John. Lafayette did his utmost to ensure that his friend would have all the support he needed to navigate his way through the intricacies of Versailles politics. He wrote a series of letters to friends and family members in France, urging them to assist the younger Laurens in any way they could. In a letter to Adrienne, Lafayette wrote, quote, "The person who will deliver this letter to you, my sweetheart, is a man for whom I care very much, and to whom I would like you to extend the warmest friendship. He is the son of Henry Laurens, who has just settled into the Tower of London. General Washington is very fond of him, and of the Americans whom I have sent to see you, he is the one I most particularly wish for you to receive in the friendliest way. If I were in France, he should live entirely at my house, and I would introduce him to all my friends and do everything in my power to assure his meeting people and spending time profitably at Versailles." End quote. In early January 1781, Lafayette saw his friend off to France before departing Philadelphia himself, bound once more for Washington's encampment at Morristown. While en route, he encountered a band of mutinous American soldiers who were marching on the capital. Discontent among the rank and file about the lack of supplies, to say nothing of the fact that they had not been paid in months, had finally reached a breaking point. In early January, some 2,500 Pennsylvanian soldiers mutinied, killing 2 of their officers and marching en masse to the capital to demand the pay that they were owed. On encountering this group of disgruntled soldiers, Lafayette tried to leverage his popularity among them to convince them to return to their camps to no avail. Ultimately, Congress caved and agreed to pay the men their back pay and to address their various other grievances, although half of the men ended up resigning anyway. When a regiment of soldiers in New Jersey followed suit and staged a similar mutiny, Washington ordered the garrison at West Point to surround the rebels and disarm them. In the face of overwhelming numerical superiority, the mutineers surrendered. 2 of the ringleaders were arrested and later executed. And now, a word from our sponsor. And now, back to the show. By the end of January, it seemed as though Lafayette's prolonged period of inaction was about to come to an end. Earlier that month, the traitor Benedict Arnold reappeared in Virginia, commanding a British brigade. Virginia, which had up to this point been untouched by the war, had suddenly become a new theater of operations. With the main force of the Continental Army still encamped in New Jersey, Virginia was effectively left to his own devices to organize its defense, a mission that the state's government was woefully unprepared to undertake. Baron von Steuben was dispatched south to take command of local militia forces, but from his reports it was clear that there was little that even he could do with the resources at his disposal. Arnold and his men, meanwhile, ran rampant through the state, raiding with impunity. On January 5th, the British captured the sparsely defended state capital of Richmond. Arnold let his men loose on the city, and for the next several days, they looted and burned anything in sight. They continued to do the same throughout the countryside in the ensuing weeks, making a point to destroy the colonists' tobacco stores in the hopes that the resulting economic losses would undermine the American war effort. News of Arnold's rampage through his home state enraged Washington, and he decided that it was high time something was done. In mid-February, he ordered Lafayette to take his light infantry division down to Virginia, join forces with von Steuben, and to defeat and capture Arnold. Should he accomplish this final objective, Washington issued Lafayette very explicit orders as to what should be done with the traitor. Quote, "You are to do no act whatsoever with Arnold that, either directly or by implication, screens him from the punishment due to his treason and desertion. Should he fall into your hands, you will execute him in the most summary way." End quote. Lafayette had no way of knowing that, as he marched south, he would be leading his men into what was to be the decisive final campaign of the war. As a matter of fact, no one, not even Washington, knew this at the time. Nonetheless, Lafayette did recognize that this was a highly important mission, both in military and political terms. He resolved to carry out this latest assignment with a degree of secrecy. He obscured the true purpose of his mission from everyone, even from his own men. He told them to pack light and prepare for a short campaign, but before they knew it, a week later they found themselves 100 miles away in Trenton, New Jersey. After resting for a short while there, they pressed on to Head of Elk, Maryland, now known as Elkton. He was told that a French naval squadron would come shortly to ferry him and his men the rest of the way to the town of Portsmouth, in Virginia. As they waited impatiently, the French squadron was intercepted by the British near the entrance to Chesapeake Bay and was forced to retreat. After realizing that their transportation wasn't coming, Lafayette pressed on some 60 miles or so to the southwest to Baltimore. There, thanks to no small amount of politicking and glad-handing, he did manage to procure enough vessels to ferry him and his men to their destination. But they did not get far, as the British fleet forced them to land only 35 miles or so to the south at Annapolis. Still quite some distance away from Virginia, Lafayette took a small detachment of men and attempted to reach von Steuben's encampment at Yorktown, finally doing so by mid-March. They waited there for 2 months before finally receiving word from Washington. He told them that he was calling off the operation and ordered them to return to the encampment in New Jersey. Lafayette rejoined the rest of his men in Annapolis by the beginning of April, but they had hardly gotten as far north as Head of Elk when new orders reached them. Washington apparently had changed his mind and ordered Lafayette to turn around and head back to Virginia. Lafayette was none too pleased with this development. He sent a reply to Washington essentially telling them that what he was asking for was not possible under the current conditions. His troops had largely exhausted their supplies, and with shortages imminent, morale had become dangerously low. He pleaded with Washington to be given more time to wait for new supplies. The commander-in-chief resisted his entreaties, instead sending Lafayette a letter intended to persuade him to carry out the orders as soon as possible by stoking his ego. Quote, "You must endeavor to get shoes before moving on. The difficulties that you will experience on the scope of provisions and transportation would have been common to any other body of troops. They will be great, but I depend very much on your assiduity and activity." End quote. Lafayette was still quite disappointed by this turn of events. He felt as though he had been exiled to the south while everyone else prepared for the final battle against the British at New York City. As he wrote in a letter to his friend Hamilton, quote, "It is probable that I will be in this southern wilderness until the end of the war." End quote. Upset as he may have been, Lafayette did not place blame on Washington for his current predicament, at least not publicly, instead directing his ire towards his own government for failing to deliver on their promises to the Americans. It was not entirely unreasonable for Lafayette to think this way, given the whole debacle regarding the other half of Rochambeau's expeditionary force. He wrote to the French ambassador in Philadelphia describing in detail the dire state of his forces. Quote, "We have neither money nor clothes nor shoes nor shirts, and in a few days we will be reduced to eating green peaches. Our feet are torn for want of shoes, and our hands are covered in scabs for want of linens. And when I say we, I do mean it in every sense, for my own baggage has been stolen." End quote. The ambassador duly passed along this information to Foreign Minister Vergennes, who in turn reassured Lafayette that help was on the way. A few months prior, John Laurens, who Congress had sent on a diplomatic mission, arrived in France. Together with Benjamin Franklin, he met with Foreign Minister Vergennes, who was sympathetic but hesitant to pledge any further material support. When Laurens presented him with the full extent of the Americans' requests, Vergennes replied, quote, "It would not be possible for the king to accede, and if he did, it would surely ruin France." End quote. The fact of the matter was that the kingdom's treasury was being strained to the breaking point. The Minister of Finance, Jacques Necker, was facing public scrutiny for the mounting debt that the French government had accrued in their support of the American war effort. Partially in response to such criticism, Necker decided to compile and make publicly accessible a comprehensive account of all the kingdom's finances, which he published in February. Known as the Compte Rendu, or the Report to the King, this document showed that the kingdom's finances were actually in excellent shape, and that the government was running a surplus. Reassured by Necker's findings that France's economic situation was stable, King Louis XVI agreed to sign off on a loan of 10 million livres from bankers in the Netherlands on behalf of the Americans. Laurens and Franklin were thrilled. Even though it was less than what they'd requested, it was still more than they expected to receive. And the French also agreed at this time to send more reinforcements to the United States. While they were forced to cancel the second half of Rochambeau's expedition on account of a British blockade, they did order Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse, commander of the French Caribbean fleet, to sail north to assist the Americans. Laurens returned to America later that year with these reassurances in hand. while Necker's report to the king managed to convince Louis XVI and the French government to throw the United States another lifeline, this decision would cause no small degree of trouble for them in the future. While it wouldn't quite be proper to say that Necker had outright falsified or omitted important information in the report, it is true that the finance minister deliberately led the king and the public at large to believe that the kingdom's finances were in a better state than they were in actuality. For instance, all foreign debts were merely written off as quote-unquote extraordinary expenses and were therefore not accounted for as they should have been. These things went seemingly unnoticed by everyone and would eventually lead to the French Revolution, in which our protagonist would play a central role, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here. On April 10th, Lafayette broke the news to his men that they had been ordered to turn around and head back to Virginia. Predictably, this didn't go over well. He had led them to believe that they were in for a quick campaign, and that they'd all be home in a couple of weeks. Practically all of his men were from the north, including a great many from New England. They were beginning to feel the adverse effects of the southern climate. Some had even contracted yellow fever. Moreover, in this phase of American history, when people tended to identify more with their individual states than with the nation as a whole, a soldier from, say, Connecticut would question why he should fight for Virginia in the first place. It wasn't long before men started deserting in increasingly greater numbers. By the fourth day, Lafayette resolved to put a stop to it, and he had one captured deserter hanged in front of the assembled division. Then he turned to address them, saying, quote, "We are having many desertions. Those who wish to desert are afraid to face the enemy. I shall meet the British head-on, and I am not afraid. If any man here is afraid and does not wish to go on with me, let him step out of ranks and say that he wants to leave, and in that case I will let him go. He will be granted a pass to return home." End quote. This rhetoric had its intended effect, and as Lafayette reported, the desertion stopped. Showing his sympathy for his soldiers' plight, when they reached Baltimore a short time later, Lafayette took out a personal loan of 2,000 livres from the city's merchants, which he used to purchase new clothes for his men. While still in Baltimore, Lafayette was informed that an additional 2,000 British troops had just arrived in Virginia to reinforce Arnold, led by General William Phillips. Interestingly, Phillips, a veteran artillery commander, had first distinguished himself 22 years prior when he led an artillery regiment at the Battle of Minden during the 7 Years' War. This was the very same battle in which Lafayette's father had met his end, blown to smithereens by a British cannonball. Given this information, it's very tempting to conclude that Phillips was directly responsible for the death of Lafayette's father. However, in my research I was unable to determine whether or not this was the case. In my view, though, the question of whether or not Phillips killed Lafayette's father is of secondary importance to the question of whether Lafayette believed that Phillips killed his father. Unfortunately, here too a conclusive answer eludes me. Of the half-dozen or so biographies I consulted in my research, only 2 make note of the seeming connection between Lafayette and Phillips. One takes it for granted that Lafayette was aware of it at the time, and the other claims that he was not, and only learned of it some years later. Back to the matter at hand. Lafayette's priority at this time remained the capture of Benedict Arnold. On April 25th, he was informed that the British were advancing on Richmond. Hoping to prevent them from taking the city a second time, Lafayette and his troops raced to Richmond in advance of the British, reaching the city on the 29th, a whole day before Phillips arrived there. When Phillips found Lafayette and company occupying the strategic heights above the city, he was sufficiently discouraged from attempting an attack. He ordered a retreat 20 miles south to the town of Petersburg to rejoin Arnold's troops. Lafayette and his men pursued them, and by May 9th, their artillery was in position to bombard Phillips' position, at one point sending a cannonball directly through the roof of his command post. By that time, though, Phillips had already become gravely ill, possibly from typhus or malaria, and he died on May 13th. There was no dramatic confrontation between the two men after all, rendering the whole business of who killed who and who knew what and when a moot point. Phillips' death did allow the Americans a momentary reprieve, and during this time, Lafayette sat down to reassess his situation and formulate a strategy. With less than 1,000 men under his command, Lafayette was well aware that he was outnumbered. Washington had promised to send an additional 1,000 men under General Anthony Wayne to support him, but this was all the way back in March, and Lafayette had received no word from Wayne since. Forced to look for alternative means of bolstering his ranks, Lafayette went to Charlottesville, where the state government relocated after the fall of Richmond, to meet with its governor, Thomas Jefferson. Despite being the author of the Declaration of Independence and being widely considered as one of the most important founding fathers of the United States, Jefferson has heretofore been conspicuously absent from our narrative. This is because through most of the war he stayed put in Virginia, where he worked to put his democratic ideals, often referred to historians and political scientists as Jeffersonian democracy, into practice. Finally meeting face-to-face for the first time, Jefferson and Lafayette immediately took a liking to each other. They conversed for quite some time about their favorite works from ancient Greece and Rome, as well as more contemporary writers like Locke and Rousseau. But when this high-minded discussion came to a close, and Lafayette turned to the reason for his visit, the governor responded meekly that there was nothing that he could do. The implementation of his democratic ideals with their emphasis on individual rights and the limited powers of government was to blame for the state's ineffectual response to the British incursion. As Jefferson himself put it, quote, "Mild laws, a people not used to war and prompt obedience, and a want of provisions of war and means of procuring them, render our efforts often ineffectual," end quote. In other words, Lafayette could expect no assistance from his new friend, Governor Jefferson. Meanwhile, Arnold assumed command over British forces in Virginia in the wake of Philip's death, though he did not hold this responsibility for very long. A week later, Lord Cornwallis arrived to relieve him of this post. Arnold was sent packing to New York City to rejoin his wife, thus depriving Lafayette of the opportunity to exact justice for his treachery. As the main commander of British forces in the South since 1779, Lord Charles Cornwallis is considered by historians to be the best British general of the Revolutionary War, or at least the most successful. In him, Lafayette faced an opponent more experienced and skillful than any he'd encountered before, which he admitted in a letter to his commander-in-chief, quote, "He inspires me with a sincere fear, and his name greatly troubles my sleep. To speak plain English, I am afraid to death of him. In the end, I have no doubt that he will give me a good thrashing," end quote. At the same time, Cornwallis, upon learning that his new opponent was the Marquis, elated at the prospect of defeating and capturing him, accomplishing what General Howe had failed to do 3 years prior. In a dispatch to his superiors, he declared, quote, "The boy cannot escape me," end quote. In early June, an additional 2,000 British troops arrived from New York City, bringing their total strength to well over 7,000. Writing to Hamilton, Lafayette lamented that, quote, "We are not strong enough to even be beaten. Until the Pennsylvanians arrive, we are next to nothing in opposition to so large of a force," end quote. Well aware that Cornwallis would try to force him to give battle, and that an open battle was certain to result in defeat, Lafayette had no choice but to retreat. He reluctantly decided to abandon Richmond, leading his men out of the city and to the northwest. Determined to evade Cornwallis, but unwilling to allow the British to continue their advance unimpeded, he had his men engage in skirmish tactics, similar to those he used to evade General Howe's forces in 1778. Historian Harlow Giles Unger provides a detailed description of these actions in his book, quote, "Lafayette's strategy of evasive action took his men along the high ground, in thick brush and heavily forested slopes, felling trees behind them to slow their pursuers, and destroying bridges after crossing each of the myriad streams and creeks that wove their way through the Virginia hills. A handful of sharpshooters covered their retreat, emerging suddenly from trees and bushes to ambush the British vanguard, with a spray of fire that stalled the enemy column just long enough for Lafayette's band to put more distance between themselves and the enemy. With each advance, sniper fire cost Cornwallis a few more redcoats, gradually but painfully eroding the morale of the British troops. They won no battles, but they exhausted the redcoats, who marched in full uniform through the stifling southern heat. Upright in traditional battle stance, they were unprepared for multi-directional fire from an unseen enemy." End quote. On June 10th, the long-waited-for Pennsylvanians, General Wayne's division, arrived, giving the Americans a much-needed boost to morale. By June 22nd, the British had halted their advance. Cornwallis's efforts to ensnare Lafayette had led his forces increasingly further inland, causing them to outrun their supply lines and forcing them to fall back to the coast. At the same time, Lafayette's forces only continued to grow as his local militiamen finally rallied to join the cause. Cornwallis, once the hunter, now became the hunted. Cornwallis's route of retreat took his army over 40 miles to the southeast, from the vicinity of Richmond to Williamsburg, and from there further south towards Jamestown, followed and harassed by the Americans every step of the way. In the north, meanwhile, recent movements of enemy troops had convinced Cornwallis's superior, General Clinton, that an attack on New York City was imminent. Cornwallis's new orders were to withdraw to Portsmouth, the last British stronghold in the state, to fortify the area and send from there any men that he could spare to New York. All signs suggested that the British were preparing to abandon their southern strategy. By July 10th, Lafayette felt confident enough to claim in a dispatch to Washington that the threat to Virginia had been all but eliminated. Quote, "His lordship, Cornwallis, seems to have given up the idea of conquering Virginia. I had the honor to command an army and oppose him. When incomparably inferior in numbers, fortune was pleased to preserve us. When equal in numbers, though not in quality of troops, we have also been pretty lucky. Cornwallis had the disgrace of a retreat, and this state being recovered, the government has been properly re-established." End quote. In an additional letter dated July 26th, Lafayette reiterated his belief that his mission in the South had been accomplished, and requested once more to return to the North. Quote, "The enemy are under the protection of their works in Portsmouth. It appears an embarkation is taking place, most likely destined to New York. The war in this state would then become a plundering one, and great maneuvers would be out of the question. Would it be possible then, my dear General, in case part of the British troops go to New York, that I may be allowed to rejoin the combined armies?" End quote. Lafayette remained absolutely convinced that the imminent, decisive final battle of the war was to take place in the North, and he was anxious as ever to participate in it. He had no way of knowing that events would play out much differently. I will warn you here that the chronology of events and decisions gets rather muddled here, so I'll do my best to put things straightforwardly, but I apologize in advance for any confusion. On May 23rd, Washington and Rochambeau met in Newport to discuss strategy. At this time, Washington maintained that they should plan for an attack on New York City as soon as the French fleet commanded by Admiral de Grasse arrived. Rochambeau proposed an alternative course of action, to attack Cornwallis's army in Virginia. There was a sound logic to this plan. New York City was practically a fortress, and conquering it was certain to cost the Allied forces dearly in both time and resources. Cornwallis's army, on the other hand, was in a diminished state, much more vulnerable to attack. Now, the confusion arises from the question of when Washington decided to adopt Rochambeau's strategy. Years later, he claimed to have known for some 12 months beforehand that, quote, "Virginia was to be the definitive object of the campaign. It was never in contemplation to attack New York." End quote. In a message sent to Admiral de Grasse in June, Rochambeau stated that Washington did in fact have his sights set on New York, but that he should instead head to Chesapeake Bay. Meanwhile, through June and July, he and Rochambeau repositioned their forces north of New York City, presumably in preparation for a siege. A message he sent to Lafayette at this time contained orders for him to keep Cornwallis's army in check, while also openly declaring his intention to attack New York. In early July, a British spy intercepted one of Washington's letters and promptly informed General Clinton of its contents. This news, which was seemingly confirmed by the recent movements of enemy troops to the north, led Clinton to direct Cornwallis to suspend his campaign in Virginia and to send a portion of his troops north by ship to reinforce him. A few historians who take Washington at his word contend that the intelligence failure had been intentional, a bluff to fool Clinton into believing that an attack on New York was imminent. To me, however, it seems more plausible that he did fully intend to carry out an attack on New York right up until mid-August, at which time a message from Admiral de Grasse arrived, stating that he intended to take his entire fleet, consisting of 28 warships and carrying 3,000 infantrymen, to Virginia. With no authority to order de Grasse to change his course, Washington realized he could ill afford to let this opportunity go. If they could surround Cornwallis on land and sea, they could force his entire army to capitulate. He abandoned the idea of besieging New York and immediately got to work organizing the redeployment of his forces to the south. Leaving behind a token force in New Jersey to misdirect the British, on August 21st, Washington and Rochambeau began to lead their combined armies, 7,000 men in total, through Pennsylvania and Maryland and into Virginia. Time was of the essence, and the success of their plan depended on Cornwallis remaining in place. Fortunately for them, he was at that very moment backing himself directly into a corner that he would be unable to escape from. Realizing that Portsmouth was too exposed, he moved his forces north to Yorktown and began to fortify the area. Located on a narrow peninsula, Cornwallis, unaware of the imminent arrival of the French fleet, thought that Yorktown would be easier to defend, at least for the time being. Washington ordered Lafayette to do everything he could to keep Cornwallis contained there long enough for the Allied forces to converge at his location. Lafayette surrounded the settlement with a ring of artillery, blocking the roads and effectively discouraging Cornwallis from making any attempt to make a break for it. De Grasse's fleet arrived at the mouth of Chesapeake Bay on August 30th. By this point, Clinton realized that he had been deceived, and he hurriedly dispatched a fleet of 19 ships south to rescue Cornwallis, but by this time it was too late. By the time the British fleet reached the Chesapeake, they found the French were already there. A battle ensued between the two more or less evenly matched fleets on September 5th. The result was tactically inconclusive, but the British were forced to withdraw back to New York to gather reinforcements. With the French left in control of the bay, they established a blockade around Yorktown. Cornwallis was now well and truly trapped. The Franco-American army reached Williamsburg on September 14th. After an emotional reunion with Lafayette, Washington, along with Rochambeau and a host of other officers, went to meet with de Grasse aboard his flagship. He was quite displeased to learn that de Grasse intended to withdraw to the Caribbean rather than risk losing his fleet when the reinforced British fleet arrived from New York. The ground forces could rely on naval support only until mid-October, and so, on September 28th, Washington and Rochambeau moved their troops from Williamsburg to Yorktown, and the siege began. Cornwallis and some 8,000 troops were caught between 14,000 French and American soldiers on one side and a fleet of 30 ships on the other. In the end, it was a fairly short campaign. After some initial skirmishing, the British abandoned their outermost defensive lines, allowing the French and Americans to move their artillery forward. On October 9th, the cannons opened fire, dealing heavy damage to the British fortifications, but after 2 days of near constant bombardment, 2 fortified positions on the Allies' right flank remained standing. With little time to lose, Washington ordered the infantry to assault these redoubts. 2 American regiments under Lafayette's command, led by Lawrence and Hamilton, were assigned to take the hill on the left, while a French regiment, led by Lafayette's brother-in-law Noailles, took the one on the right. On the night of October 14th, under the cover of darkness, the Allied troops went over the top, charging the enemy with their bayonets, and after 10 minutes of vicious melee combat, the British surrendered. With these positions having been captured, the Americans and French moved their artillery further forward, reducing what remained of the British defenses to rubble. The British tried one final last-ditch effort to escape across the estuary, but to no avail. With no other recourse, Cornwallis knew that he was defeated. On October 17th, Cornwallis sent a messenger to the American lines, waving a white flag. He proposed a ceasefire while the terms of surrender were negotiated. The British asked to be granted honors of war, meaning that they would be allowed to march out with their flags waving, bayonets fixed, and their band playing their own music. Washington objected on the grounds that the Americans had been denied these same honors after the Battle of Charleston a year prior. Cornwallis initially tried to push back, but acquiesced. On October 19th, the formal surrender ceremony took place. Washington, Rochambeau, and de Grasse signed the Articles of Capitulation, as did Cornwallis. Feigning illness, he declined to appear, instead sending his adjutant, General Charles O'Hara, to suffer the humiliation of handing over his sword to the victors. The British troops then began to file out into a nearby field, where they were to lay down their arms. Flanked on one side by American soldiers and on the other by French, the British turned their faces towards the French troops as they marched, as an intentional slight to the Americans. Lafayette had the band play the song Yankee Doodle as loudly as possible to force the British to turn around and acknowledge their presence. And with that, the Battle of Yorktown had come to a close. In his letter to France's Prime Minister, the Comte de Maurepas, Lafayette declared, quote, "The play is over, Monsieur le Comte. The 5th act has just ended." End quote. None could deny that Yorktown was a highly significant victory for the Americans, but there remained a degree of uncertainty as to whether the battle would force the British to open peace negotiations. We'll save our discussion of the ensuing diplomatic maneuvers for the next episode. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, the thought that the war might continue seemed far from everyone's minds. For several days, Lafayette and his fellow officers celebrated their victory, making toast after toast to the United States, to France, and the eternal friendship between the two nations. At one point, Cornwallis, in the spirit of goodwill, invited Lafayette to meet with him. Apparently, Cornwallis was taken aback by his adversary's appearance. He had not imagined the boy, as he referred to him, to be so tall, or prematurely balding as he was. Together, they looked over their maps, retracing the maneuvers of that summer's campaigns, and their interactions were apparently rather amiable. In a letter to Adrienne, dated October 22nd, Lafayette wrote, quote, "I pity Lord Cornwallis, for whom I have the highest respect. He is kind enough to express some esteem for me, and after having allowed myself the pleasure in the capitulation of repaying the incivilities of Charleston, I do not intend to carry my vengeance any further." End quote. At the end of the month, as the festivities wound down, Lafayette, along with Noailles and a handful of other French officers, departed Yorktown, but not before he bade an emotional farewell to his troops. Speaking in the third person, he addressed them as follows, quote, "In the moment the Major General leaves this place, he wishes once more to express his gratitude to the brave corps of infantry who for 9 months have been the companions of his fortunes. He will never forget that with them alone he had the good fortune to maneuver before an army which was 6 times superior to them." End quote. If there was any more to the speech, however, it was apparently not recorded. The next order of business was to go to Philadelphia in order to formally request Congress to be granted leave. They obliged him not only this request, but also designated Lafayette as an advisor to the United States diplomats in France. Technically, the wording of the resolution extended to all American diplomats abroad. Quote, "It is the desire of Congress that ministers plenipotentiary of the United States should confer with the Marquis de Lafayette and avail themselves of his information relative to the situation of public affairs in the United States." End quote. Congress also assumed a portion of the debt that Lafayette had incurred in supplying his division and sent him along with an official letter of commendation to the King of France, reading in part, quote, "Major General the Marquis de Lafayette has in this campaign so greatly added to the reputation he before acquired that we are desirous even to obtain for him on our behalf notice, in addition to the favorable reception that his merits cannot fail to meet with from a generous and enlightened sovereign such as yourself, and in that view we have directed our minister plenipotentiary to present the Marquis to your Majesty." End quote. Not that he had much need for Congress to vouch for him to the king. A week before he left for France, he received a letter from the Marquis de Ségur, the Minister of War and father of his friend the Comte de Ségur. The elder Ségur informed Lafayette that, in view of his accomplishments in America, the king intended to promote him to the rank of Field Marshal upon his return, a rank more or less equivalent to the one that he currently held in the Continental Army. From Philadelphia, Lafayette and company went to Boston, where they intended to board the ship that would take them back to France. They reached the city by the first week of December, but once word got out that Lafayette was in town, crowds of cheering citizens turned out and practically blocked his access to the harbor. They spent the next several days treating the hero of 2 worlds to various festivities and celebrations before finally allowing him to board his ship, which set sail a full 10 days later. On December 21st, the day before he departed, Lafayette wrote one last letter of farewell to General Washington. Quote, "Goodbye, my dear General. I know your heart so well that I am sure that no distance can alter your attachment to me. With the same candor I assure you that my love, my respect, and my gratitude for you are above expression, that at the moment of leaving you, I felt more than ever the strength of those friendly ties that forever bind me to you, and, by my zeal and services, to gratify the feelings of my respect and affection. Will you be pleased to present my compliments to Mrs. Washington, and remember me well to General Knox and to General Lincoln. Farewell, my dear General, your loving and respectful friend, the Marquis de Lafayette." End quote. Lafayette's conduct during the Virginia campaign earned him much adulation both from his native country and his adoptive one, and cemented his status as a hero of the American Revolution. The French ambassador to the United States, Conrad Alexandre Girard, reported to Vergennes that, quote, "The prudent, courageous, and amiable conduct of the Marquis de Lafayette has made him the idol of the Congress, the Army, and the people of America." End quote. Indeed, practically everyone who had made his acquaintance during his time in America, from the lowliest enlisted man to the most prominent statesmen and military commanders, sang Lafayette's praises. The soldier and diarist Joseph Plum Martin, who served under him during the Battle of Yorktown, wrote of him, quote, "The general knew well what he was about. He was deficient in neither courage nor in conduct, and this was well known to all the Revolutionary Army." End quote. Another veteran of the Yorktown campaign, Alexander Hamilton, who was absolutely no fan of France, it should be mentioned, wrote of the Marquis, quote, "The United States are under infinite obligation to him beyond what is known." End quote. Lafayette's countrymen on the opposite side of the Atlantic, who had been following his every move with anticipation, sang his praises even louder. Foreign Minister Vergennes, writing to Lafayette on behalf of Maurepas, who unfortunately died that November, congratulated the Marquis on his successful campaign. Quote, "I would have trembled for you if I had not been so certain of your wisdom. It takes a great deal of skill to resist as you did, despite a huge disparity of forces, a man so talented in war as Lord Cornwallis. It was you who led him to his fatal end, when, instead of making you a prisoner of war as he planned, you forced him to become one himself. History offers few examples of such total success." End quote. The play that was the American Revolutionary War was indeed over, and Lafayette, at a mere age 24, could boast of having played a pivotal role in the victory. He'd personally fought and bled for the American cause. As a major general, Lafayette deserves no small degree of credit for his leadership during the war, especially during the Yorktown campaign. But perhaps more decisive than his military role was the diplomatic one. Lafayette had successfully managed to leverage his fame and fortune to induce France to grant significant assistance to the Americans, without which it was highly unlikely that they would have won the war. Of course, we've already spoken at quite some length about Lafayette's exploits, both diplomatic and military, and it does us no good for the narrative to further enumerate them here, because, again, it's worth noting that at this time Lafayette was just 24 years old, and that there is still quite a bit left in his story. Rest assured there will be a full retrospective of his life and actions in the final episode of this series, but for now though, I will have to end the narrative here. When we return in 2 weeks, we will follow our protagonist as he returns to France in triumph. Never one to be content resting on his laurels, the Marquis would continue to work tirelessly to advance the interests of the United States, playing an important role in the flurry of diplomatic activity that would eventually lead to a peace settlement that formally ended the war against Great Britain. But again, all of that will have to wait until next week. In the meantime, please feel free to direct any and all comments, questions, and concerns, and anything else to my email address, perspectivesinhistory@gmail.com. You can also reach me on Twitter and Facebook. Links to both sites will be in this episode's description. If you like the show, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whichever podcast listening platform you prefer to use. Also consider purchasing some used books from me on eBay. A link will be available in the episode description as always. Anyway, that is all for now. This has been the Perspectives in History podcast. Thank you for listening. I'm your host, William Connor, signing off.
Par les flambeaux de l'auguste assemblée,